in the night when Olof Palme was shot, it was a stay-behind exercise in the area where he was shot. And that was the reason why people have seen men with walkie-talkies and so on, because there were no mobile phones at the time.
You know, for anyone still under the impression that Sweden suddenly joined NATO at the beginning of this year, 2025, because of Ukraine or Russia or some newfound sense of Western camaraderie, let's just say you have been played big time. This wasn't spontaneous, it wasn't reactive. It was the endgame of a decade-long psychological operation. Slow, methodical and deeply embedded in what Professor Ola Tunander, my guest from today, has called the deep state logic of Western security strategy. And if that sounds conspiratorial to you, good, it's supposed to. That's the protective coding that kept this entire machine running undisturbed since, say, World War II. But let's briefly rewind to the 1980s. Sweden, neutral on one hand, proud on the other, and fiercely independent, starts suddenly experiencing these weird submarine incursions. Soviet subs, they said. Silent intrusions just outside of Swedish naval bases. The media panic was choreographed with almost theatrical precision. But here's the kicker. Many of those Soviet subs, turns out they were Westerns. NATO, possibly even American or British, running covert ops in Swedish waters to frame the Soviets. Let's give this a moment. They faked Soviet aggression on Swedish soil. Why? To prime the population, to stir fear, to erode neutrality. Sounds familiar? And hovering over all of this is the ghost of Olof Palme, Sweden's most progressive and frankly most inconvenient Prime Minister. Inconvenient not for the Swedish people but for the Swedish secret rulers and for the co-joint twins of evil conspiracy, the US and the UK. Palme called out US imperialism. He spoke to Castro. He condemned both superpowers. And he suddenly, in 1968, boom, he's shot dead. On a Stockholm street, no bodyguards, no motive, no killer, just a black hole where Swedish innocence once used to be. Now here's where it's getting dark. Operation Gladio, NATO's so-called stay-behind army network, which we're discussing in the interview, has been linked to false flag terrorism across Europe. Italy, Belgium, even Germany. And these weren't rogue cells. They were state-sanctioned assets, trained, armed and funded by MI6, the CIA and their friends. The purpose? Manufactured chaos. Blame the left. Shift public opinion. You really can't make this thing up. NATO militias, armed, trained and funded by MI6 and the CIA, ran false flag terror campaigns across Europe. Real bombs, real bodies, all to steer public opinion. And then, cracks in the dam. Italy's Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti was the first to break the silence, but not willingly, he was cornered. But once he opened his mouth, boom! The Gladio skeleton started falling out of every European closet. One by one, other leaders admitted it too. Turns out democracy had a few side arrangements. But why go through all this trouble? Because neutrality is a liability, a threat. It couldn't be trusted. Neutrality is dangerous, they whispered. You need the Americans, and maybe, I'm saying maybe, just maybe, the assassination of Palme wasn't just a Swedish tragedy. Maybe it was a geopolitical reset. Fast forward to today, and Sweden is in the NATO. No referendum, no real debate, just the usual parade of talking heads, spinning fear, selling security. And what do we get? American bases, of course, intelligence integration and a seat at the war table. And you're supposed to believe this was the democratic will of the Swedish people. Today I'm speaking with Professor Ola Tunander, one of the few who dare to name what others don't even whisper. Ola has spent decades peeling back the layers of these covert operations, and he was asking some uncomfortable questions. Who benefits from fear? Who engineers the narrative? And what really happened to Swedish neutrality? So get ready, because once you see the machinery behind the curtain, there's no unseeing it. Before we now continue, let me just briefly mention that my Twitter account has been suspended. No big deal, I'm already building a community on Substack, a more or less decentralized platform where no social media oligarch can shut you down. So if you like my work, consider joining me there. It's free and the link is in the description below. Professor Ola Tunander, what a pleasure having you again. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very well.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Just for a little bit of context, you are Professor Emeritus at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo in Norway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have been there I'm now, as an emeritus, you are retired. And I'm sitting at home, you could say that, but I was at the Peace Research Institute for 30 years.
What's your specialty?
I wrote my doctoral thesis on maritime strategy, U.S. maritime strategy in 1980s. I had my doctoral dissertation in 89, so it's a few years back. And so that's, and I'm studied security politics, international politics, military strategy, and deception, and how you fool your counterpart, for example.
That's a very interesting topic. Deception, propaganda. I'm not sure, and this is not planned. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're aware of NATO's cognitive warfare program since 2021. Are you aware?
I've just read something on, but not really.
Okay. So when you say deception, what do you mean?
That's it was an interview with Tom Reed, who was a deputy national security advisor for the United States during the Reagan administration. And he was asked about the deception committee and so on, and about the CIA. And then he said, deception, that is what CIA is doing. They are fooling. They are fooling the counterpart and your friends, actually. So it was very much, it was not just fooling your enemy. For example, then at the Reagan time, at the Soviet Union and so on, you were also fooling the Europeans. And this was highly classified. And so that was because the Europeans had to believe, from the American point of view, that the Soviets were a very dangerous enemy. So then you have to do certain operations that made the Europeans, and not least the Nordic countries, believe the Soviet Union was a very dangerous enemy just now.
And that, of course, please.
Yeah, no, so that was, for example, the Americans were flying bomber forces over the North Pole, going towards Soviet territory. But exactly when they reached Soviet territory, they turned away and turned back again. And that meant that the Soviets became more and more alert and prepared. And the Europeans could recognize that the Soviets became more prepared, but they didn't know about these bomber forces, the American bomber forces. So what the Europeans saw was the Soviet or Russian reaction to the Americans, and they thought this was kind of a preparation for an offensive operation. This is deception. This is how you fool your friends, because you will control the perception of your friends, actually.
Yeah, and we're gonna counter, we're gonna work us there. But you're absolutely right. There was a situation in the early 80s where apparently the Russians had nuclear bombers already with running engines on the tarmac, thinking that America would attack.
Yes, that was the case. It was Able Archer exercise, and the NATO prepared, had an exercise, and they believed that this was they had very clear, very realistic exercise, and it was so realistic that the Soviets believed that it was preparation for a real nuclear war.
For first strike.
For a first strike. And thanks to a spy in shape in the NATO headquarters, he was an East German spy, and he informed the East Germans that this was actually not a real attack, but an exercise. So, and that was very, very important. So I think it was a very dangerous time, you could say, but it's also dangerous now.
Yeah. So the fate, what you're describing, the fate of the globe as we know it today, depended on one single person, this specific spy informing the East Germans that what the Russians believed to be a preparation for a first strike, for a nuclear first strike, was in fact just an exercise, right?
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible.
I think his name was Rainer Rupp.
I completely trust you. Yeah.
Yes.
Now let's bring this back to today. Now, we have seen that Sweden has joined NATO, and for a naive observer, it seemed, believing our Western media bubble that that Putin woke up one day and decided, I want to invade all of Europe. I mean, this was basically what we are being sold. Ukraine is only the first step, and the other countries will follow. Now, Sweden was then kind of, without much public debate, to my knowledge, put into NATO. But if we look into history, and this is where you come in, if we look into history, Sweden joining NATO is long in the making. And I would invite you to go back to the Reagan administration. And I'm doing it specifically because I have heard you talking about, so I know you're very, very knowledgeable in that specific regard. Now I have a couple of notes here. So, and you scratched on it already. The Reagan administration implemented a psychological warfare tactics aimed at influencing Swedish security policy and public opinion. And we're gonna come back to this when we talk about the U-boats. Swedish public opinion must be aligned to US strategic goals. And now it comes under Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. And you talked about deceiving the Soviet Union already, but also their own population and the NATO population. Keyword again, cognitive warfare program of NATO, which has exactly the same goal. And there was a committee for deception operation was implemented. Yeah. Now the president, the secretary of state, and the secretary of defense were deliberately kept uninformed. The guy who actually was leading this was the then CIA director. So I leave it at that encapsulation for a moment. So just briefly, Sweden's joining of NATO has not happened overnight right now. So NATO and its allies and the US as a driver has prepared that for at least since Olof Palme, since this Reagan administration. So if you could walk us through what really happened there.
No, it's I mean, maybe you could go a few years back even further.
Please do. Please do.
It was preparations for using Swedish air bases already from the early 1960s, perhaps even from late 50s and so on. And that United States should be able to use these forces, and also in the early phase of a war. This was a view that had a strong perception, a strong support in part of the military forces in Sweden, some top generals and admirals. And but Olof Palme was most likely, he knew about it, but he was most likely against it, and he did not hand over this policy when he left office as prime minister in 1976. So this was you had this kind of planning, and you had also planning against Olof Palme in parts of the military circles during the 70s. And I spoke with James Schlesinger. We had a seminar in 1993 on nuclear weapons outside Oslo, in Rjukan, and about his view on the Swedish administration, or on Sweden, while he was Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA and Secretary of Energy and so on. And this was in the 1970s, and he said, which Sweden? The political Sweden or the military Sweden? The military was planning for us to come as soon as possible. Or actually, he said, wanted to come as soon as possible. But then I called him 10 years later, and he said that, or 5 years, yes, okay, that he wanted to change that to that they were planning for Sweden to come as soon as possible. And this was even stronger, so to speak. So it was clear that in his view and in the American view, there were two Sweden. And you had the official political Sweden, and you had quite secret military Sweden, which only was some handful of or 10, 15 senior military officers who believed that Sweden was part of the Western world and should act as part of the Western world and should not try to keep its neutrality. But that was in the night. What happened in the late 70s was, in all the Nordic countries, it was a quite strong peace movement, and which created a lot of trouble, both in the United States and in the UK, in Great Britain. So they, for example, the Norwegian prime minister gave a New Year's speech in 1981, where he proposed a nuclear weapons-free zone for the Nordic countries. And that was totally unacceptable for the British. You could read the archives, the documents from the Foreign Office and from the Defense, and it was clear that this was totally unacceptable. And they had to speak harsh with the Norwegians, and the Swedes were even worse. So this was a problem, but the real problem was not the political leadership. The real problem was the population. And to change the views of the population, you had to have some kind of operation so the people believe that the Russians are really coming. And then they had these submarine operations that were very successful. They went in with Actually, they had submarines operating secretly in Swedish.
We're gonna come to the submarines. We're gonna come to the submarines. Yeah.
Yes.
We are not really there yet. I have a question. So you just said the UK was really against a nuclear-free Nordic regions, and when you said this, I right away had to remember Boris Johnson, who in the early stages of the Ukraine war apparently was sent to talk to Zelensky and tell him, no, 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 you will not stop fighting, right? So why is the UK always on the side of those who are supporting war?
Yeah. Maybe it's their own colonial past that makes them think in these terms, that they have, in collaboration with you had a special UK-US relationship during the Cold War and also after the Cold War. And this was also a very strong intelligence relationship. And some British leaders, professors, military officers argue very strongly that they should have, that they would push for a conflict. And I think it's really, to some extent, I could see that there is more of a understanding on the American side of the dangers of nuclear war. The Americans are well prepared for a nuclear war, but they also very much realize the danger of a nuclear war. The British often argue that it won't be any nuclear war, so you could do anything you want. And that, in that sense, I think the British had become, in recent years, definitely, they are the most hawkish of the great powers. Then, of course, you have the Baltics and so on, that could be quite hawkish also. I remember that we had the conference in Tartu, I think, in Estonia, in 1993, I think, and it was a discussion about the Narva corridor, as it was called, a small strip of land where it was only Russians living on the other side of the Narva River, close to the Russian border. And the Estonians demanded this strip of land. And then the issue came up, what about to negotiate with the Russians, and the representative for the defense ministry said, you don't talk with Russians, you shoot them. And Estonia had, at the time, I think, 1.8 million inhabitants, and Russia had a little bit more. So it was clear that there were no kind of realistic thinking in some of these countries that have been under Soviet rule, you could say, during the Cold War. And so it's, but Sweden was divided. Sweden had a lot of people coming from the Baltic countries, and not least Estonians, that were refugees during the Cold War, and they were belonging to the groups of people who were very much in favor of close ties to the United States and to fight the Russians. That was their very clear view. And we had a seminar when in '89 with an Estonian dissident, and we had talks and so on. And in Bari started to make Sieg Heil salute, also Nazi salute, and he was told that this was not proper in Finland, as it was. So he accepted that. But you had these Eastern countries, you had a lot of very, I would say, right-wing radical activists. And of course, in Sweden, there were not just on the top level, of course, there were, you could say, you had political Sweden with Olof Palme, for example, and you had a military Sweden with some admirals and generals who were preparing for US forces to land as soon as possible when the war started. Actually, the West German, if one believed that it was that it would be possibly a Soviet attack from East Germany into West Germany. And in that case, the American Air Force in West Germany has to go somewhere. And the best basing area for these airplanes was Sweden, because Sweden was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And that was what really, this was the Swedish role in the Cold War. So, while the Norwegian, in Norway, the American attaché, defense attaché, was a naval officer. In Sweden, it was an Air Force officer, because Sweden was, for the Americans, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And of course, Olov Palme knew that if Sweden would let the Americans use Swedish air bases, these air bases would be taken out by the Soviets in the war. And which means that, and you couldn't do that so easily at the time with conventional weapons, with aircraft bombing Swedish air bases, because the Russians or Soviets would lose very many aircraft. So that would be almost unacceptable. So that means that they would use missiles with nuclear weapons. And for Sweden, that was not so favorable. So it was, I think that was a major reason why Olof Palme did not hand over this secret strategy to his successor, Thorbjörn Fälldin, in 1976. And then Olof Palme came back in office in 1982.
You briefly mentioned UK driving the war. That was not only the case here, it was also Tony Blair, of course. And I did some research here in regards to the Iraq war. It was actually Tony Blair who kind of, pushed pushing, I'm not sure it's the right word, but really drove Bush, to really have this war. And now we are seeing something that really puzzles me. Now that the US is pulling out of the Ukraine war, it seems, but the Europeans are pushing for this war. And paradoxically, and there's a second pipeline I would like to discuss with you, and paradoxically, Nord Stream, so Russia is now in negotiations they have already started repairing Nord Stream, but there are now discussions ongoing to reinstall the gas flow, because one of these pipelines is still intact. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And whilst apparently this is no longer a problem for the US, it now seems to be a problem for Europe. So, and again, with the UK in the background, pushing their agenda. So in your perspective, and I know I'm diverging a little bit, but under the context of propaganda, yeah, What, in your point of view, why are suddenly the Europeans so eager that they're committing 800 billion US dollar per year, which is supposed to be funded from private money, yeah, also from pension funds, from bank accounts, etc., etc. Why are they so desperate to have a war with Russia?
Mm. No, I think it's what has changed really from the Cold War is that the Scandinavian states have become more or less subordinate under the British in very many. So, for example, there was an interview with Michael Clarke, who was heading Royal United Services Institute, who was a professor in defense studies and who had been in the defense ministry. And he argued September last year that the problem at the time was that Biden did not want to go to war. He was thinking about what people would write about him after his presidency. He was so they were unwilling to use long-range missiles. The British got a no in mid-September, and then this changed in December. But still, it was obvious that Biden did not want to have a large-scale war in Europe, which, according to Michael Clarke, was disappointing because they were not willing to take the risk of a large-scale and he said he did not believe in any escalation to nuclear level, and then he said that it is the British, the Scandinavians, and the Baltic who is pushing for the more. He didn't use the word hawkish attitude, but that was what I would characterize it as. So while the South Europeans and the Germans were much more hesitant and afraid of a nuclear escalation. So that was his estimate or his understanding of the political situation in Europe. And if you compare that with the Cold War, the Scandinavians were always much more cautious and wanted to have a zone of detente in the Nordic countries with some kind of neutrality for Finland and Sweden and a base policy for Norway and a nuclear policy for Norway that did not create a direct threat to the Soviet military bases at the Kola Peninsula. That was, of course, the most sensitive, and you were not allowed. The Americans and the British were not allowed to have any bases on Norwegian territory and not exercises in the eastern county of Norway. But they did anyway sometimes. I mean, special forces went there and they were caught by the Norwegians. And what my Norwegian admirals and generals friends had told me was that the British were more risk-taking than the Americans. So also during the Cold War, the British were actually very pushing for some kind of tension conflict, and that was while they didn't speak about it. So that's why I think the understanding, or my understanding, before I spoke with a lot of military people, was that actually the British were more cautious because they didn't speak too much. But actually, what they did was quite problematic.
They did it from the background, yes, under the radar, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were actually responsible for the British were responsible for the stay-behinds in the Nordic countries, in Scandinavia at least, and so there were American-linked stay-behinds, but they were, as I understand it, kind of parallel stay-behinds. But the British, the training.
Before, Professor, now you mentioned a hot keyword, the stay behinds. Now, for people, and most people will not know what that actually was, so we have to explain. I would like to mention one thing. Dr. Daniele Ganser, a historian, a Swiss historian, has written a whole book about stay behinds. So maybe first you encapsulate what the stay behinds were and what they were for, but then you also need to explain what in reality they actually did, because they were very closely linked to terrorism in Europe. Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, it was the idea. I mean, the origin of the stay-behinds was from the Second World War and the resistance movement. So, for example, in Norway, it was a direct link from the resistance movement to the upcoming stay-behinds. So the head of the resistance movement was organizing the stay-behinds in collaboration with the British, actually, Jens Christian Hauge. And you had also, I mean, in Sweden, you didn't have the same kind of resistance movement because Sweden was not occupied, but you had people who were well trained militarily and had operated on the Eastern Front in Finland. So they were, and some of them, or quite a few, were, you could say, right-wing radicals. And while, for example, the resistance movement in Norway did not have this kind of origin, so it was, but also in Sweden, one tried to organize it so it was directly linked to the Social Democrats and to the big industry people, and that was so it's, in certain respect, you could say it's different from what Daniele Ganser wrote very much about Italy and Germany and some other countries where they recruited the directly fascist military people and police people, and in Germany, the SS people, they recruited them to the stay-behinds. And firstly, because they had to have something to do. And that was, so it was a practical matter in a way. But also, they were definitely anti-communist. And they were then be good fighters against the communists. And the idea was, I mean, what one organized it for was that one believed that the Soviet Union in a war would go forward with its army forces, and the Western forces might have to retreat. The point would be that you would have people staying behind in these areas where were occupied by the Soviets, and function as a resistance movement. That was the idea. But in for example, Italy, it became the problem, and France, the problem was not primarily a Soviet invasion. After some time in the 50s, one saw that the Soviets will not invade really. But the problem was a domestic situation. and the strong position of the communists. And then they used these forces for domestic purposes, as to put up bombs and for example, at Christian Democratic headquarters or something belonging to the Christian Democrats, and then claimed it was the communists that did it. And this was what was
deception.
called
Deception. We come back to deception, what you said at the beginning. Yeah.
So you had some people who were Bill Harvey, who was one of the top people in the CIA, or relatively top people, close to Angleton in the CIA around 1960. He was not treating, or they were planning assassinations. And also, you now would know that Kennedy was one of them, so to speak. And then Kennedy didn't like Harvey, so he sent him to Europe. And then he came to the CIA station in Rome, in Italy, where he pushed for these kind of operations with creating trouble with the kind of bomb attacks and these kind of things. And this continued very much in the late 60s, early 70s, and they had huge bomb attacks on that many people died and so on. And then they claimed that it was
the left
or communist or whatever who did it, but it became clear afterwards that it actually was a fascist group, and it was fascist group that were linked to the intelligence services that had done it. And they had to leave for South America, for example. So, but the point was that these kind of organization that formally speaking did not exist, or officially, I would say, they did not exist. And then they could be used for other purposes, and to, for example, to change the politics in countries. And that was what they were used for. And I think in Germany, one of the Americans who were involved in these things, he realized that 200 SS leaders were part of the stay-behinds. So it was a kind of quite dirty word, but in the Scandinavian countries, it was the British, and the British were training with the Scandinavian stay-behinds by using special forces landing from submarines, Oberon or Purpose class submarines, and in Norway and in Sweden. And that was also quite secret. And so this was the British role, except for deception in the Scandinavian countries when it comes to submarines, was to land special forces for training with the stay-behinds, the local stay-behinds.
If you allow me to encapsulate this, yeah. So stay-behinds, the idea came from the Second World War to have a functioning armed resistance group, which is highly trained, highly armed, highly equipped, and highly funded in each of the NATO countries. So there was not just a handful of countries, it was really in every single NATO country these stay-behinds were placed. You said it already, they mostly came from the extreme right. They then turned inwards, committed acts of terror, and blamed it on the left. That's the encapsulation here. The interesting part is, and I believe it was the Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi who actually went public. Yeah, and then one European government after the other had to admit, oh, sorry, we didn't know, but we also have stay-behinds in our country. Yeah, so at that time, that was a pretty big, can we say scandal? I don't know if it's a scandal, but it was a really big affair. Yeah, please.
I think it was Andreotti actually.
Oh, Andreotti, yes, true.
That went out publicly.
Yeah,
but it was known to a certain extent before that, but it was not generally known, so to speak. So I was, for example, in Washington in autumn 89, and I had a meeting with, I had a friend or someone who knew Bill Colby, who was the director of the CIA during Nixon administration. And I was interested in talking with him, so I visited him in early November 89, and because he had been CIA station chief in Sweden in early 1950s, so I knew, and he wrote in his book about the stay-behinds. He didn't call it stay-behinds; he called it resistance movement. But it was but that they created this resistance movement in the Scandinavian countries. They were actually before he came there, but they created parallel stay-behinds. So I wanted to ask him about it and generally the CIA relationship and so on, and it was clear that when he spoke about it, he used exactly the same words as he used in his memoirs. So I mean, these kind of people, they know exactly the words they use, and can pick up. They don't, because they could not make a mistake or say something else, So that was so I was in certain respect impressed by that but he wrote about it in late 70s actually, but he didn't call it stay-behinds, and for the Scandinavian countries. But that was but as I understand it, the British got the codes. It was some conflict in the Norwegian stay-behinds in late 70s, maybe early 80s, because the Norwegian leadership had handed over the codes to the British, and that, I think, in general, the stay-behinds came under the Scandinavian stay-behinds. There were before that also British responsibility primarily, became under the British umbrella.
Yeah, but now you have to explain what the codes are.
The codes. It was two codes that were signal when you send signals about mobilizing forces and so on. So this was but it was, the point was that firstly, I think what happened was that the stay-behinds in the Scandinavian became closer tied to the British, firstly, and secondly, that at least from the late 70s, Sweden was also part of a NATO committee dealing with stay-behinds, the Allied Clandestine Committee. Maybe it was also earlier, but that I don't know. But at least from the late 70s, one was part of the Allied Clandestine Committee that did the planning for the stay-behinds in the NATO area and for the special forces training collaboration with the stay-behinds. So that's I think this was supposedly the only committee that Sweden participated in the 1980s in NATO, and we had a investigation on the submarines in 2000, 2001, headed by Ambassador Rolf Ekéus, who was a former ambassador to United States.
Swedish ambassador? Sorry, Swedish ambassador?
Swedish ambassador, yes, to United States. And he was also responsible for the Iraq, UN responsible for the Iraq in the 1990s about disarming the chemical weapons and so on.
Is he still alive? Do you know? Is he still alive?
Yes, he's still alive, but he's getting older. That's but he did not. He had only one source on this. Sweden participated in the Allied Clandestine Committee, and he didn't dare to write it in the report because he had not enough evidence, so to speak. But that was it was clear that the most senior ambassadors did not know. It was only a small section of the military people who knew.
Yeah. If we move on now, so I try to flesh out what you already said, deception, under the umbrella of deception, and we can be a bit more specific. Deception in terms of forming public opinion, because any war needs the support of the public opinion, of the public and the public opinion. So we already established that Reagan had a whole deception committee. I want to drop again the keyword cognitive warfare, which is implemented by NATO as we speak, and not just now. They're already busy with it since 2021. We will not discuss this, yeah, but it's about shaping the opinion of the own population. Yes, it's also targeted at the other population, but the main target is the own population, yeah. So we could argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, that terror acts like we saw in Italy and other countries, which have been executed by these so-called stay-behinds, are exactly that. This is propaganda in its worst, because they shaped public opinion by pretending or by blaming the left, while actually the right executed those terror attacks, right?
Yeah.
So that's deception in its most gruesome form, right?
Yeah. And that was, I think, you adapt the deception to the local circumstances. So, and in Sweden, of course, you had a military, for historical reasons. Sweden had a lot of conflict with Russia from the 17th, 18th century. And military people turn to read history. And it was a lot of worries about Russians and Russian submarines. And that was, so it was very easy for the Americans and the British to just use this instrument to go in with submarines in Swedish water and make the Swedes hysterical, because that is what happened. People became hysterical because they thought the Russians were coming. And it was not they didn't go in with the U.S. Regular U.S. submarines because they were too large, you could say, for the Baltic Sea. So what they did was they had from the mid-60s, there was an agreement between Bobby Inman and some people on the Swedish side, most likely Sven Andersson, who was a defense minister of Sweden for 16 years, and an agreement about putting out hydrophones, also small microphones in the water, along the Swedish coast, because the Swedes wanted to know what the Soviets were doing in Swedish waters. And they knew that the Soviets went into Swedish territorial waters. But what did they do? Why did they go there? And so on. And then there was an agreement between the Swedish chief of intelligence and the US chief naval intelligence to send one man. So he was assistant attaché in Sweden, assistant naval attaché, Bobby Inman. And he was, but 2 days a week, he was working at the Swedish Defense Ministry and trying to find out what the Soviets did. And what he found out was actually that the Soviets were not interested in Sweden. they were training their submarine captains, because the same submarine captains that entered Swedish waters later became captains of nuclear submarines going along the US East Coast. So that was the point. And the Swedes were not happy with this conclusion, because they wanted that Russians were interested in Sweden. So they didn't make a big fuss about it.
If you say the Swedes, I think we need to be more specific. The Swedes, you mean this small elite on top of Sweden who was proposing closer alliance with NATO or even NATO membership, and who was this hawkish kind of element that actually pushed for a war with Russia. So it's not all of Sweden; it's this small.
No. Okay, true. Yeah. I made a mistake, but it was the Swedish naval officers, they did not publicize this, and it was but what was a result of this enterprise, this hydrophone enterprise from the US naval intelligence in Swedish waters, was that they were so secret, so they could not have a cable into land. So they were lying there on the seafloor and sending signals to patrol aircraft passing over them. But that on information about the Soviet submarines. But that was, you have to maintain these hydrophones. And to do that, they had small submarines. So they went in with merchant ships with a door in the bottom of the ship and in the hull, and then they went up with these merchant ships along the Swedish coast and then to Finland or North Sweden or whatever. And then they dropped the submarine in Stockholm archipelago or in the southern Sweden, and they maintained these hydrophones, and then the merchant ships went back and picked up these submarines. So they were not based in the Baltic Sea. And this was extremely secret. But the point was that they had this kind of system. They had these small submarines operating in Swedish waters. So in the 1980s, what the CIA director Casey could do was just to let this submarine appear on the surface for a short while,
on purpose. On purpose.
Just to make the Swedes hysterical. So that was the point. And it was even better because in 1981, in October 1981, a Russian submarine or Soviet submarine went up on an island in Sweden, in the Swedish archipelago, deep into the archipelago. And this was a very strange thing.
So whiskey on the rocks. You're talking now about whiskey on the rocks, right?
This is the whiskey on the rocks.
Yeah.
Because it was what in NATO you called the Soviet submarine 613, called it whiskey class. So you call it a whiskey class submarine. And then, of course, for the British, they know that when you have a whiskey, you have to have some rocks. And that was, so when it went up on an island, and it was called whiskey on the rocks. And it went in on a fjord that was so shallow that you couldn't dive. So the question came, why do you go in with a submarine in a place where you couldn't dive? So it was the responsible officer, the chief of staff of the naval base south in Karlskrona, who were interviewing the crew, or some top people in the crew. He was very confused by first the captain didn't know at all where they were and so on. So that was one thing, but also it was clear that they had gone on surface deep into this fjord in the evening, but and it was dark and so on. But it was a very narrow fjord. So go there, you had to go exactly the right course. And so it was very difficult to do it. But if you wanted to have an espionage operation, you wouldn't go with a submarine on surface. So that didn't make sense. But then he realized that this was something fishy with this. I mean, firstly, the first strange thing happened in the morning was that the two American attachés were outside his office.
Whose office?
This chief of staff of the naval base. It was the submarine had gone up on an island very close inside the fjord, very close to the Sweden's naval base south.
So, maybe we should provide a little bit more details. Yeah. So there was this, and I have the documentary where you featured in Still Open. According to this documentary, and they have film material, there was on parts only 50 centimeter of water under the submarine. So this submarine knowingly went into a fjord, as you already said, who was not only very narrow, but also there was not much. There was no way that this submarine at all could dive. It was just not. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about the actual beaching of the submarine before we come to what happens after.
Yeah. No. That what this chief of staff, Carl Andersson, he told that that when it came to this island and went up, and he had divers, Swedish divers, going down and checking everything underwater and so on, and they found a sand wall behind the propellers, some 8-10 meters behind the propellers, were quite visible sand wall, and which means that the submarine had tried to go forward higher up on the island, which something you shouldn't do. So it was very strange, and also you could say that the Soviets were looking for the submarine. They realized something was wrong, and they were going in out with aircraft, two aircraft that could land on the water to pick up in an emergency situation, to pick up the crew and so on. But the problem was that these aircraft could not land in Sweden among the island. There was quite narrow islands, so it was no point with having these aircraft. The base in Baltijsk, which was the Baltic Sea Command for the Baltic Navy in the Soviet forces, they did not know what was going on, and they did not know where the submarine was. But it was clear that something was, very wrong, and actually, this chief of staff should have interviewed the most senior officer. He told his superiors which officers he knew were on board, and it was actually one quite senior officer on board, and he had done the navigation the last 24 or almost 48 hours actually, and his superiors, also the Swedish superiors to the chief of staff, did not want him to interview him. So the only one who really knew was not interviewed.
So just to confirm this, yeah. So you said already the captain did not know where he actually was. So normally the captain is the highest rank on a U-boat, but in that specific instance, there was another person on this boat who outranked the captain and who told the captain what to do. This is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. So it was either Navy captain or commodore. He was two ranks higher of the captain of the submarine, and he was there because it was the first trip of the captain on his own submarine. So it was not unusual that you had a senior officer on board on this kind of occasion. The problem was that why did not the Swedish responsible for southern Sweden, an admiral or a chief of staff in Stockholm, why did they not want to interview the only one who knew something? And then it was a British document, according to Peter Wallenberg, who was a Swedish industrialist. He spoke with the Swedish chief of defense, and he said that according to him, the Swedes knew. According to this British document, the Swedes already knew that the submarines were going to come, and which was pretty strange, so to speak. So it seems that this senior officer on board, that he had some kind of agreement with someone on the western side, and then also about when it comes to this documentary you mentioned that Dirk Pohlmann made. He interviewed Ace Lyons, Admiral Ace Lyons, who said, yes, I did it. So this was I mean, someone from the CIA had told me that Ace Lyons was responsible for the operations in Northern Europe, naval operations in Northern Europe, very secret operations. And so I told Dirk Pohlmann, who was doing this interview, that he should interview Ace Lyons, which he did. And he was he said a lot of things, even a lot of things that are not in the documentary, actually. So that was so he played an important role. And I spoke with one naval officer later who said that Ace Lyons told too much.
Okay. Now I made myself a couple of notes here, and there were 3 points, if you allow me. Yeah. So the submarine incidents in Sweden are strongly implied to be part of the Reagan administration's deception efforts to influence public opinion and security policy. That's point one. The goal of the Swedish submarine deception was to undermine Olov Palme's neutralist policies and push Sweden closer aligned with NATO. And third, the media and the elite that you already mentioned wanted to manipulate the public opinion of Sweden. Would that be fair to summarize?
Yeah, I think the media, so most of the media did not understand what was going on. So they deceived the Swedish public, but they did it unknowingly. So they did not understand what they were doing.
They really believed there was a Russian submarine and they want to, what I don't know, spy
Yeah.
or yeah.
Yeah. It was one journalist from called Dagens Industri, Daily Industry, Anders Hasselbo, who had some very good military contacts and who told him that the submarines actually were from the West. But he had no influence at the time at all. And he interviewed the chief of army in 1987, who said that two submarines that went out from the Baltic Sea after the incidents in the bombing of submarines and so on in October 82, these submarines must have been Western submarines, because otherwise they would not go out through the Baltic Straits, Danish Straits. But this was not taken seriously, and so it took a long time. It was actually I was in the submarine inquiry 2001, headed by this Ambassador Ikeus, and this was clear that I mean, there were some documents you could read, and one document from the former chief of intelligence to the prime minister in late 87, Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson, after Olof Palme had been shot. And he wrote that the two types of submarines that they found in Swedish waters regularly, it was called Type 1 and Type 2. And the Navy claimed that they must be Russian or Soviet submarines. And they were one very small and one little bit bigger. But what the chief of intelligence wrote was that neither of them fits with known Soviet submarines. So it was the small one was 10 meters long, and the longer one was 20 to 30 meters long. and the descriptions of these vessels that are, quite close described, they fit exactly with some Italian vessels. But the larger one was what the Americans most likely used for this maintenance of the hydrophones. So it was a cosmos.
If my information is correct, then these operations were largely successful, because it seems to me that the population, the percentage of the population in Sweden who felt threatened by USSR, also Soviet Union, rose from 27% to 83%, coming back to deception and propaganda. So in that respect, these operations were largely, vastly successful.
In 3 years.
In only 3 years.
So
yes.
it really changed Sweden.
Yeah.
From 1 year to the other, almost, So yeah. Sweden became a different country.
Yeah. Then I have one question for you. Why did Sweden not join NATO in somewhere 1982, for example? And why did it join now? I mean, they had as much reason then. They were as scared from the Russians then as they are now. So why didn't they join then, despite the elite really trying to? What prevented this?
Yeah, but I think in the social democracy, there were strong forces supporting neutrality, and the population supported neutrality despite the threat. So it was Sweden had been neutral since 1814. So it was more than 150 years now, more than 200 years. So it was not. You had to do very much to change that, to change the opinion. But still, of course, you had people who wanted Sweden to join NATO, but that was not even at the time. Not even the Conservative Party could argue for that, really. Even some people, Carl Bildt was definitely, very closely tied to the Americans and the British.
And now, why was it so? I mean, there was hardly any public debate now when Sweden actually joined NATO. That seemed to be like almost an overnight affair. How was that possible?
Yeah. No, it was also the case that the former prime minister, the new prime minister, just a couple of months before had said that Sweden is neutral and that should not be any change of that. And then suddenly it changed. And partly, it was very strong forces on the right-wing side, you could say, and on the industrialist side. I think that the Saab company with the Wallenberg family, they saw that they could not sell the airplane really if they didn't, if they were not part of the club, and they had. This was one aspect of it, but also the Social Democrats became afraid that they would lose the upcoming election, and they didn't want that the foreign policy and the neutrality policy would be part of the discussion during the upcoming election debates, and they thought that they would be able to win if they accepted NATO membership, which was stupid. But they didn't win either. so it's I think, but also in media there must have been some kind. So I don't know how it functions really, but most senior ambassadors wrote that Sweden should not join NATO during these weeks of debate. And their articles were not accepted by the newspapers.
What was his name again?
It was several. I mean, it was.
No, the ambassador's name.
Yeah, also Rolf Ekéus, but also Hans Blix and Pierre Curie and Matthias Mossberg. I mean, their articles were not. I mean, they have difficulty. Put it that way. They have difficulty to publish their articles. So it's a.
Anyone who goes against the mainstream narrative at today's media landscape is kind of deplatformed, shadow banned, pushed to the margins. Yeah, that's yeah.
But it doesn't matter if they even are the most senior.
Exactly. Look at Simon Hirsch. He's one of the most distinguished journalists in the US. He cannot publish anywhere anymore. He publishes himself today at Substack. I mean, anyone, exactly like you said, it doesn't matter who you are, what's your past. Yeah.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
No, so that's tragic. But it's a change. I mean, if you go back a little bit to the 2000, then there was an interview with Caspar Weinberger, which was who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense. And he said that, in a long interview, and he said that we operated regularly and frequently in Swedish waters. And this, of course, became a big thing. And the submarine inquiry in 2001 was appointed because of Caspar Weinberger's interview.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, and it was also an interview with the British Navy Minister, Keith Speed, who said the same as Caspar Weinberger. We did it. And it was necessary to keep the Swedish forces alert and so on. But when there were Gallup poll, and so I think it was perhaps 60% that believed then that, okay, it was Western submarine or both Western and Soviet submarines. But 15 years later, all this were forgotten. And everyone said it must be Russian submarines. It was, I mean,
of course, Russia blows up its own pipeline. Russia is responsible for anything these days. Yeah.
Yeah. So that. But when I met at the conference, I met John Lehman, and I had written my doctoral thesis on his maritime strategy. So we had something to talk about, and I asked him about this Weinberger interview, and he said that the decision was taken by Bill Casey, by the CIA director, and he said that it was a deception committee and it was Casey and as head of the committee, and then it was the National Security Advisor Dick Allen, and it was undersecretaries of Defense and State. So it was not it. So the idea was that the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the President should have plausible deniability.
They were not informed. That's why they were not informed. Yeah.
Yeah, or if they were informed, they could claim that they knew nothing.
Yeah.
But this was the point with this deception committee, actually, and when in this documentary that you referred to, that Dirk Pohlmann did the Reagan's, in German it was Täuschung der Methode Reagan.
The Reagan method. I see it here. Yeah.
Yeah, that he also confirmed, John Lehman confirmed the existence of this committee and so on. And so, but I think this is quite interesting, and I don't think there is any other.
No, there is one more thing. I cannot avoid talking with you without mentioning Olov Palme's assassination. So very, very broadly, I mean, first of all, for people who do not know, Olov Palme, then Prime Minister of Sweden, was assassinated by a lone gunman on the street on his way to or from a cinema with his wife. And this assassination has not been solved till today. Now, it's probably also worth mentioning that this happened just 1 or 2 days before Olof Palme was supposed to travel to Moscow to meet Gorbachev, to have discussions about a détente between Sweden and Russia. And of course, that you already said that the elite, the military elite, and maybe also the industrial elite in Sweden, the second part of Sweden was not in favor of Olof Palme. So if I would ask you not asking the person, yeah, but which interest group, and maybe in the back of our minds still stay behind, yeah, I don't know, yeah. So which group of interest do you think might be responsible for Olof Palme's assassination?
Also, firstly, he was going to Moscow 1 month, not 1-2 days after, but 1 month after the killing. So it was going in the first days of April or something like that, and he was shot on the 28th of February. But I think that it's clear that he had been he wanted to have he started what was called an investigation or a commission from the related to the United Nations with Americans and Russians and some other Europeans and some from the third world also, to find out about the possible change, the closer collaboration with the great powers. That was the idea. I mean, it was called common security. So the idea was that the security of your security is not, you are not secure if the other side does not feel secure. So you have to think in terms of how the other side thinks. And on the Russian side were Georgy Arbatov, who was a close advisor to the Soviet leadership and also the very close advisor to Gorbachev. And on the American side, it was Cyrus Vance, who had been Undersecretary of State and maybe also Secretary of State for, yeah. So the idea was to collaborate, and this was unacceptable for the Reagan administration at the time and for Thatcher. So they were strongly against this kind of collaboration, and it became impossible after the submarine incident started. It was impossible for Olof Palme to have normal relationship with the Soviet Union because of the media situation in Sweden. And in 1986 he went against the media actually, and what you had also at the time, you had in the autumn of 85, also a few months before, you have what was called the Naval Officers' Revolt, which was group of naval officers claiming that Olof Palme was not trustworthy, that one believed that he was collaborating with the Soviets. And what you had was, for example, submarines that you knew, you have clear indication of submarines, and suddenly when the submarine was on its way out, they received ceasefire order. So they had to let the submarine out. And for the people at the time, it was obvious that it was Soviet submarines. So it must have been, so they believed that Olof Palme must have let the submarines out in collaboration with the Soviets. That was the case. And they then thought that Olof Palme was a traitor. And for example, the head of this so-called naval officers revolt, Hans von Hofsten, who was a commander, also not very senior officer, his superior told Swedish TV that he was informed about the meetings of some of this group. It was police officers also, and they had discussed how to get rid of Olof Palme. They had not discussed any specific method to kill him, but they had discussed how to get rid of him. And then Olof Palme's close advisor and state secretary, Ulf Larsson, told that he and Olof Palme was informed about these meetings. And what he remembered also was that they had done Hitler salute.
You said so, yeah.
No, but yeah. So this was what you would call right-wing groups inside the police forces and inside the Navy. And some of these forces were probably linked also to the stay-behinds, actually. So it was in the night when Olof Palme was shot, it was a stay-behind exercise in the area where he was shot. And that was the reason why people have seen men with walkie-talkies and so on, because there were no mobile phones at the time. And that was, and it was also kind of quite, some documents that had been made public now from the inquiry, and there was a security service document claiming that it was this special exercise was also dealing with assassinations and to take out people who were so-called carrier of information. And these people were, it was the idea, the exercise, it started with that where an enemy had taken over Stockholm area. And of course, that would be then Soviet Union had taken over Stockholm area. And you had small groups coming in, special force groups and stay-behind groups, or kind of stay-behind groups, coming in from outside, setting up headquarters in the Stockholm area. And one task would then be to eliminate certain people so the enemy should not be able to take care of them.
Was there not a list published with names? Or am I confusing this now? Was there not a list of targets published?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But this was this that I refer to now was a security service document, and that tried to analyze the situation, so to speak. And so I think we don't know exactly who did
it.
But we know much more today than we knew just 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we knew much more than we knew 20 years ago. So at least we knew something. And you could say that it's very clear which interests that thought that Olof Palme was a very problematic person.
He had powerful enemies within Sweden, within UK, within America. And I just saw that President Nixon already called him the Swedish asshole, pardon my French, and accused him to be an agent and KGB influence agent. Yeah, that goes already back to Nixon.
Yeah, I mean, Nixon called him that Swedish asshole, but this was agent of influence. I know that James Jesus Angleton, who was a CIA counterintelligence guy for 20 years or something like that, he was kicked out actually by Bill Colby, that I mentioned before, in 1975. But the Swedish counterintelligence chief for the Swedish security service had Angleton as his opposite number and visiting him at Langley, and that was CIA headquarters, and Angleton had told that he considered Olof Palme as an agent of influence, and for these kind of people in Sweden, what the Americans told was the truth, so to speak. So they considered him a kind of agent of influence, and they also, he said that they could not report. He didn't write down in the files about Olof Palme because we have a traitor at the security service, Mikael Bentler, because he was a traitor because he spoke with Olof Palme. He reported to the prime minister what the security service were doing.
What a crime! Yeah.
Yes. So that was I think another indication of a divided Sweden, if you want.
Professor Tunander, you have been really, how shall I say, the second time talking to me. I'm really grateful for your time. You have been generous with your time. At this point, I know we could discuss many more things, but I think for today, I really thank you for your time. It was an enlightening discussion, and I say it often, yeah, I cannot promise that you don't hear from me again.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One last thing in case you missed it, and it matters more than you might think. Critical voices like the ones on this channel, they are not just being ignored, they're being targeted, silenced, shadow banned, deplatformed. Not in theory, not in some distant or valiant future, right now. You might not realize, but that is the point. I've got the numbers, the patterns and your messages that you're seeing on your screen right now to prove it. And if that's not enough proof for you, Twitter, now X, has suspended my account. No bots, no spam, no TOS violation. Just the wrong kind of questions aimed at the wrong kind of power. But here's the good news. They can't shut us all down if we decentralize. That's why I'm building a community on Substack. Substack is a place no algorithm can strangle, no platform oligarch can erase. So if you value sharp, unfiltered analysis that doesn't follow the mainstream narrative, the kind that cuts through propaganda instead of parroting it, join me there. Because if we don't support independent voices now, soon there won't be any left.